Welcome to Happy Talks with Dr. Alice and Donovan. Dr. Alice Fong is a holistic naturopathic doctor and founder of Amour de Soi Wellness. And Donovon Jenson is a software engineer and founder of HowToHappy.com. Together, they're out to cause more happiness in the world.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Happy Talks. My name is Dr. Alice, and this is my awesome co-host, Donovan. And today we are talking about becoming a better communicator. I mean, we've talked about communication a lot on this podcast, but we're specifically diving into improving our communication skills. So, Donovan, what are your first thoughts when it comes to improving your communication?
Yeah, so the first couple things that come to mind for me are, one, basically, what is the way that you're communicating, or I guess like making sure you're communicating to your audience in a way that makes sense, right? So, if you're calling someone versus writing to someone, writing to a friend versus writing to a business versus sort of sussing out the context of the way that you're trying to communicate. Then another major piece to me is the clarity of the message, right? Because I feel like poor communication, a lot of times it's comes out in ways that are either not specific enough, or you didn't say what you intended to, or something like that. Mm-hmm. And then I think the last piece is I think it's really important, the exact words you choose to communicate things. I feel like there's a lot of instances where using one word versus another, even like that might seem really small, actually has a really big impact in how well the message is received. So that's separate from sort of the clarity of the message, right? Like whether or not what you mean to say is being communicated, right, but sort of the tone or the style in which that message comes across. So those are some of my first thoughts. I'll be curious what you've got.
Yeah, actually, just based on what you said, it made me think about like a communication breakdown in my own relationship recently, where it's just like fighting over something silly. And it was literally like a semantics thing of like, I was saying, oh, you occasionally do. I wasn't saying you do it all the time, but you occasionally do this. And in his mind, it was like, I do it frequently by saying occasionally, when in his mind, he was like, I do this rarely was the thing. And I was like, I feel like occasionally and rarely can be like interchangeable depending on, and like occasionally it could be like once a month, it could be once every few months. That's rare in my mind, but we were arguing about that, and it can really come down to semantics sometimes. And I think it really comes down to, are we communicating and understanding each other? Are we like, I mean, what I'm saying might be what you're saying, but in a different type of way. And the other thing is like, the big part of communication I think is really important is like the listening aspect of like repeating back what they said and like reassuring, like, did I really get what you said? Like, I know this is what you meant when I said occasionally. I meant rarely. Maybe I needed to lay that out for you, but and I don't have to do that with everyone, but for this situation, I did.
Oh, I know, for just to follow up on that, on my relationship, like we've made a lot of progress moving our fights away from sort of what we think the other person means into these semantic conversations, right? Like,
yeah.
So many more of the fights, the root is at what do you mean by the word you're using, right, as opposed to we disagree. Like, right. For me, it's what is it? If something gets suggested to me saying that sounds good or that sounds fine is interchangeable. Those mean the same thing to me.
Yeah.
My partner does not take that the same way. And that's one of the things that we had to work out, is just that the message or the content wasn't the point of contention. It wasn't like, I'm willing to do this. Like, oh, you're willing to do this? Well, that I hate that, like that wasn't where the problem was. Right. It was in a matter of like, fine to me is equivalent to good, and fine to her is a step lower than good, or maybe several notches below, right? Like that sounds fine is sort of a, right, I will allow this to happen, as opposed to like, right, I agree to this sort of plan. And so those are the kinds of things that, even though they seem really small, right? Like, and you could probably say those same two sentences, or have us sort of two paired sentences really close together across a bunch of people, and a lot of people wouldn't know the difference. Or it might be the opposite, right? Where like every single person is like, fine is not good. Like that's not the same thing.
Right.
Those little details can make such a big difference when you're trying to negotiate up to things that are even harder, right? Like you can get bogged down on something small that doesn't matter at all because of the semantics. And good luck solving anything actually hard if you can't even get that part figured out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, totally. I've been in that place many times. And in like hindsight, it's almost ridiculous that we're getting so worked up over such little things. But let's dive into like some heavier things, perhaps, when it comes to communication breakdowns. And I think it's like the other thing that we've talked about a lot on this podcast is assumptions. And I think like, I can say one thing and in my mind it means something, but like I get like it's interpreted a certain way and they have to like fill in the gaps in their brain on their life experience and what they interpret it as, and they make assumptions that I really meant this, even though I meant this. And so I have found myself many times in a situation where I've had to clarify a lot more and add more of like my context, realizing that I guess my communication wasn't sufficient to really get across what I really meant.
Yeah, I think, it's easy to think about sort of like, hey, what can we do by ourselves to just like improve communication? But it's always a two-way street. And as part of that, part of it is paying attention to sort of how other people are receiving or seeming to receive the message that you're trying to communicate, right? Like even with the examples that we've just had, like you can say something and you also need to pay attention to how the other person is receiving it, because if you're paying attention, a lot of times you can tell early on before there's some kind of miscommunication or problem or whatever else, like that doesn't seem like it landed correctly. Like what I meant didn't seem to be interpreted the way that I meant it to. And you can only get that from paying attention, because you could say the exact same sentence to two different people, and depending on the context or how they interpret things or what certain words mean to them, you might be getting two totally different things. So I think that's another important aspect to pay attention to is, communication is never just this like, here's my strategies and you can just stick to it. Like sometimes you might have to slow down or add more context, and being able to pick up sort of how well the other person has received your message,
right,
and then kind of contour the rest of your messages around that is really important, because if you want like a rule of thumb, slowing things down and getting more clarification is rarely going to cause more problems. But in general, you just have to pay attention to how the flow of things is working.
Yeah, and if it's in the context of like a relationship, whether it's a significant other or a family member, someone that you interact with on a sort of regular basis, it's like you start to learn, how they tend to interpret what you say, and how sometimes you have to add in a little extra so it doesn't get misinterpreted, because like literally like a constant reoccurring fight that we have is like, if I say like something critical of him, he automatically goes in his mind that I'm saying he does this all the time. And I'm like, I'm not saying that. I'm saying it happens once in a while or occasionally, and I'm just giving feedback. But I have to clarify and add this like, oh, sometimes you do this on occasion. I know you don't do it all the time. I have to add that in now because I know where his brain goes. I know you don't do it all the time, but could you please do this moving forward? I know you're good about it a lot of the times, but I get that we're human and sometimes we forget. But I think it helps ease the criticism, I guess, or it's received better by him, even though I get annoyed that I'm like, why do I have to do this every time? And so we get into that a lot. Yeah.
Well, I think it touches on a good point where the language that you choose, the amount of specificity that it has built into it, leaves things open for interpretation. So when you say something like, this happens occasionally, in your head, that might be 30% of the time. Yeah. And in his head, that's 75% of the time.
Right.
And those things get interpreted differently than they're intended. And so like that's one thing that I actually really had to learn when I switched into software, because I was in a very bad habit of exaggerating quite a bit in a way that I didn't think was it was like trying to make my language more colorful, but a lot of people were taking it literally, and it was causing a lot of problems for me because it was vague, right? I would say something like, oh, this program sent out 1 million requests, and I meant it like it sent out a high volume of requests, not literally 1 million. But then people I was working with would take that as like, send out 1 million requests. Like, what is going on with it? Like, this is super broken.
Yeah.
And then I would have to backtrack and be like, oh, well, that's not actually what I meant. I meant, this other thing. And so I was in a really bad habit of that. But it funnels into this sort of like root of the amount of ambiguity that you leave in your statements, or the amount of interpretation or like work you expect other people to do to know exactly what you mean, can cause problems. I would wonder if for your situation, if you said something like, oh, this happens half the time, or 1 every 4 times, you know what I mean? Like something
like an actual
specific.
percentage.
Yeah. I wonder if that would land better or not. And I'm not suggesting you need to do this. I'm mostly just saying like it would take out some of the levels of ambiguity. Now that cause more of an argument around like 30%. No, wait, it's more like 15%. But
we argue about that too, actually. It's like, I say you do this 30% of the time, and he's arguing that he does it like 15% of the time or something like that. And then we've had the fight about like, I've said like, you do this like the majority of the time is different than most of the time. Very, very different in its head. It's like majority of the time is, I guess, slightly more than 50%, but most of the time is more like 80 to 90%. And I'm like, I don't know.
That's funny. That's exactly how I interpret it. I'm like, yeah, the majority of the times means like just barely the majority. Like just barely squeaked it through.
Over. And I'm like, okay. There could be a wide range, but but kind of like switching gears, the other thing I wanted to comment on when it comes to communication is really trying, as I've learned, is like one of the things that I have to really be aware of is if I'm in a reactive or triggered state versus a receptive open to listening state can determine how well of a communicator I can be. Because if I'm triggered or reactive, I'm not really present enough to really receive whatever it is that they're saying, or it's just like filtered through like this upset lens, so it's not going to land as well. So like, if we are in a fight and it's like not really progressing and we're both triggered, it's like sometimes we have to like take a few breaths, or just, take a few minutes or a few hours apart just to like decompress, and then come back in a state where we're a little calmer, and then we're much more effective with our communication. That seems to make the biggest difference, is being present to what state am I in, so I can be aware of how well of a communicator I can be, because I'm guilty of being a really terrible communicator sometimes and being a really fantastic one. So it really depends.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, because, like I was mentioning before, it's always 2 people, or at least 2 people, right? You're trying to get a message from someone to somewhere else. And one piece of that I think a lot of people maybe over focus on is, how is my message getting out into the world? But there is also the piece, particularly in like conversations or relationships or whatever, is around like, how much space am I giving for the other person to communicate? Like, what sort of environment am I helping produce for them? Because like you were saying, when you're in, at least for me, when I'm in the more reactive sort of states, the environment that I'm creating, my message might be perfectly clear. I might be communicating from myself out to the world a message that is perfectly clear and coherent, but I may not be communicating out like that there's openness and receptiveness and space on this side of the conversation for me to actually hear things. So I feel like the more, grounded you are, the more in a good space you are, the more you are able to communicate the sorts of things that can be really difficult. Like, for example, if you disagree with someone, you still want to ideally acknowledge them, at least, right? At least acknowledge that they made a point,
Right.
and then you can disagree. But when you're in that more reactive space, it's almost always just like, are you kidding me? No, blah, 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 instead
Right.
of leaving that conversation open with space. So
Mhm.
I found way more mileage out of focusing on ways to sort of create that space or that environment, as
Mhm.
opposed to really fine tuning the way that I communicate my message across.
Mhm. Yeah, totally. I really resonate with that because, and I think you really touched on an important point about like recognizing when you're reactive, and that like creating space is super important. And it's like, and this is something I remember early on in a relationship, we're much better about it now, is like the trouble with understanding that's like, yes, we can have different perspectives and they both can be valid. We don't have to agree on everything. But yeah, in his mind, it's like, if I validate her perspective, then I'm agreeing with it. And I'm like, that's not what I mean. It's like, it makes a difference when you can validate. And I think that creates space. And that way it's like, there's no wrong or right perspective. It's like a perspective is a perspective. And when you try to understand it, it can really, help both parties feel heard and understood. And that can go a lot further um, when people are feeling heard versus like, this person's just totally like, everything I'm saying is just going over their head. And it's really frustrating.
Yeah, because I feel like, when you don't open up that space or make it known that you're listening and acknowledging them,
Right.
then they are more likely to go into a reactive space. And
Mhm.
then that's more likely to cause you to start being reactive. And that's when it spirals into a completely unproductive
Totally.
conversation. So,
Yeah.
since it's between two parties, like you never have full control, but
Mhm.
keeping yourself as grounded and in that space and open as possible for as long as possible is one of the things that you have the most influence over.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, the other thing I think I'd want to add, which, I've had to practice myself, my partner has had to practice with me. It's just like, you know, if I'm not feeling heard, then I actually say the words like, hey, I'm not feeling heard, even though he might think he knows what I mean. And he says he really believes that he understands me. And I'm like, I don't feel like you do. The exercise of just like, can you repeat back what I said? And I will assess if I feel like I've been fully understood. And if I don't, then, giving that person the space to clarify anything that was missing in whatever that person said in the reiteration of what they were trying to understand.
Yeah, that sounds really similar to there's a couple like communication exercises that people can do or that I've run into where obviously you do it in lower stakes conversations to begin with so that you can build up the skill so that it's available to you when higher stakes or more emotionally intense conversations are happening. But it's like, I'm trying to remember the exact details. You do something like you have to ask a question, and the other person, they're like scripted questions, and I can't remember any of them off the top of my head. But the other person gets to talk for as long as they want, and you can't interrupt them or say anything until they say that they're done.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then you try to rephrase what they've said.
Mhm.
If they don't feel like you got it, then they keep going, and then you just go back and forth. And that might seem like a little overly formal or like a lot for some people, but it does get you into, it sort of like forces you into some of these habits around slowing down the conversation, making sure both sides feel heard.
Mhm.
And if you can practice that in smaller scale conversations, it comes much, much more naturally when you are in the more intense sort of situations, especially if the person you practice with is the person that
Right.
you're having the other more intense conversation with.
Yeah, totally. That's actually been an exercise that my couples therapist had recommended we do, because a lot of the times when we're communicating, I don't know if we're communicating, we're talking to each other. It's like, I'll say something and then he's saying something in response or reaction or defense of what I'm saying. And so I don't feel heard. And then I'm more upset because I'm not feeling heard. And then he's saying like, well, I'm not feeling heard. You're not getting me. And it's like, okay, well, we have to take turns so we can both feel heard. And yeah, so let one party completely express what they want to say without any reaction or defense or anything from the other party. It's just like your goal is to just hear the other person, understand them, repeat what they said, ask any clarifying questions. And then it's like when they feel completely heard and understood, then we can move on to you and you can explain your side of the situation. The ticking turns can really make the difference, because otherwise it's like both parties are not feeling like either one is getting gotten or understood.
Yeah, and when you get to that point, it's like a death spiral immediately.
I know it is.
No conversation I've had has ever recovered from just like both of us feel unheard. It has
Right.
only escalated to the point where it's like, okay, I have to take a break from this conversation and try again later. So
Right.
that's another really strong and useful strategy, is if you feel the conversation heading in that direction, to put aside what you want to say temporarily
Right.
and ask a bunch of questions about what the other person is saying until you and they are confident that you have the same understanding.
Mhm.
Because if you don't have that, then you just end up pushing against each other, and the space for you to make your point never really opens. It may open like as far as you are able to talk, but the space in terms of the mental space for like, okay, I'm ready to receive a message,
Right.
is unlikely to open up when things start escalating like that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's a practice on it's an ongoing practice, and it's not easy. And I think we just have automatic, like our brain just automatically wants to react to stuff and like share our point of view. So it has been like an ongoing practice of just like taking a step back. Let's just try to understand this person completely without adding my 2 cents. And it actually has made a big difference in not just my romantic relationships, but just like business, work, family, like friendships, also all sorts of relationships. Yeah.
Yeah, we've been focused a lot on romantic relationships, but it really, and that's probably a place where a lot of people feel the most contention, just because if you're in a long-term committed relationship, that's the most frequent interaction you'll probably have, the most frequent person.
Right.
So it's the most instances of interaction, so the highest chance that you've had some friction. But yeah, these sorts of principles tend to work well in any kind of conversation, right? Like anytime you're communicating with someone, if it seems like some sort of misunderstanding is starting to brew, or things aren't clear or whatever else, slowing down and being able to ask the questions really makes a big difference. And also being heard on both sides makes a big difference for conversations that seem like it may not make sense. I know when I was working in customer service, both on the phones and over social media, there was a huge number of people that would feel like their problem was resolved whether or not it was, as long as they felt validated, right? Like there was a number of people calling in with like, hey, I feel like this was a waste of money or whatever else. And some people really stuck hard to sort of the materialistic outcome, I guess I'll call it. Yeah. But a way higher percent were looking or satisfied with like an emotionally nice sort of outcome, which was really interesting to me, because that's not something that I would, when I think about something like customer service, I'm not thinking typically of like, oh, this is an emotional interaction. I'm thinking like this is a business interaction of sorts, or like, oh, they want X, Y, or Z done or fixed or resolved or whatever else. But though the emotional outcome of the conversation actually makes a huge difference.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, even if, for all the customer calls, service calls that I've had to do, which I generally don't want to do because they're not pleasant usually. But if I feel like, the agent was nice and they did the best that they could, and they were, they got how I felt wronged or in whatever fashion, then even if I didn't get what I wanted, whether it was a refund or something else, or yeah, I probably would just let it go instead of escalating the situation further. Yeah.
And I imagine the opposite is also true, at least it is for me, which is to say that if I have a really shitty customer service experience,
Yeah.
it doesn't matter if the food was super good or the product was the best or whatever else, like I still have a negative impression of the brand and I still don't want to continue doing business with them.
Right. Totally. Yeah. All right. Well, I think we covered this topic really well. Do you have anything else to add before we wrap up?
Nothing too specific, but just at a high level, we don't really have like the time or space to get into this, but also just like I mentioned, the specific words you use for situations can make a big difference, and it can make a big difference for how things are received. So if that is the piece that is tripping you up or the thing that seems like you should be focusing on, I would look at some resources for just like how to, or like what kind of words work best for the thing that you want to use. It's kind of a hard and sort of vague problem, but I know, some people come across as like, oh, this person's an asshole. And it's like the intent of their messages is not that. And it is largely around the word choice. So if you've been getting sort of repeated messages in that vein where your intent is not that, sometimes it is, and then your word choice is on purpose. But just look for sort of resources or ways to write out messages that have the right feeling, because I've seen a lot of people trapped by that. Maybe it's because I'm in the software space and there's a lot of problems with that, but I personally benefited a lot from just like looking at my word choice and more specifically choosing words that communicated both the intent and the tone of what I was actually trying to.
Yeah, no, I've done something similar, and I think it can really make the difference if you're intentional. Yeah, that's a practice too, being intentional. So because when we're talking, it's like words fly out, and yeah. All right, so thank you everyone for tuning in this week. If you appreciate us, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Help spread the happiness in the world. We'll see you next time. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and then go and subscribe to my channel and ring the bell so you get notified when the next video comes out. And if you check out in the description below, go to my website where you can get my free fast and easy guide to stress relief. Thanks again for checking us out, and we'll see you next time.